of course, now my boss calls me. Hey, I think we're live. How's it going, everyone? Pro tip, don't ignore your boss when he calls you. Welcome to another game developer, Unity game developer stream. We're going to have to workshop that name.
Yeah, add a few more. Add a few more words there, Charles. Unity, computer,
Unity
game,
3D.
electronics.
This is a game stream where myself and I guess you've officially become my co-host,
I guess so. Yeah.
Jason, who is a professional game developer. We're going to answer your questions, take some questions about game development, about programming, about Unity. We are programmers, but we can answer pretty much any question you throw at us. We'll give it a go. Unless it's about MMOs. If you ask any questions about MMOs, that's going to lead to a rant, which, hey, if that's your thing, you can do that too. Once we answer a couple questions, we're going to hop into a code review. We have some code lined up here. And if you haven't joined already, hit us up on Discord. The link is in the description of this video, and you'll be able to find the code review channel. If you drop your code in there, we'll try to fit it into the next stream. Also, speaking of code reviews, in order to sort of incentivize you guys to let us rip your code apart live on stream, we're very nice, I think. I'm working on some sort of giveaway to people that whose code we review. So maybe it'll be like an asset off the Unity Asset Store, or gift card or something like that. We'll think about it. But yeah, drop your code in there, and by next week we'll have something for you. Got anything to add, Jason, before we answer questions? I see that someone's queuing up a question.
Actually, I do kind of have a follow up to that one. It's not a full rant. I want to add a little bit of an asterisk because
Okay.
I think rumors of my hatred of MMOs are greatly exaggerated.
It's clear the air right here,
Yeah,
live on
yeah,
the.
So one thing that was brought up was a few people were complaining that the comment I said was specifically saying, you shouldn't make MMOs in Unity, and it's 100% not the argument. If anything, I think Unity is in the best place it's ever been in terms of making MMOs. I just don't think you should make MMOs at all. I just think it's a bad idea from a business decision. But even if you ignore my business, because it's just purely a personal thing, I just don't think right now the market's ready for it. But even if you ignore that, even if you ignore all of that, my point was simply you shouldn't make it for your first game. I mean, obviously, if you've made MMOs before, I'm not saying don't ever make MMOs again. I'm saying if you think you're approaching games for the first time and you're asking questions like, how do I do networking? How do I do multiplayer? How do I program X, Y, or Z? You might have a few other steps to go before you jump into how do I make an MMO by myself as a one-man team. So yeah, it wasn't quite what people thought it was as a rant. I'm not saying Unity's bad for MMOs, and I'm not saying MMOs are bad as a platform. I'm saying, one, don't make it your first project, and two, realistically, I still wouldn't recommend it in this market regardless. But go for it if you are confident, because I personally wouldn't take the risk. But they're very different arguments than, never make MMOs or MMOs are bad. So just this is a camera-paced version of the argument, but yeah. You can see the other one.
it's a tough pill to swallow, but just because what is it about MMOs that are so fascinating? And I think about it too. I have ideas for MMOs. Who doesn't, but it's I don't know. It's just it doesn't seem very feasible. It's not something that's easy to manage in the long term, I think, because I mean, besides the coding aspect of it and the managing of servers, just purely from a game development standpoint, you need to provide content regularly to keep your audience engaged. If you have an audience, if you have a player base. So first it's like attaining the player base, then it's keeping them interested. And in order to do that, it's pretty much like if it was your first game and you actually made it, it'd probably be your last game because you'd just be updating content all the time just to make it relevant. So, yeah.
And I can't stress this enough, right? If you're doing an MMO, like regardless, if you're doing any game, you can actually find there's this guy who released his first game. I don't know. It was an interesting story. He spent like 30 years building this game, and it started out as
30 years.
He was a kid. He was going to make this game, and he kept adding to it. It's a really fascinating story to read. And even this guy who spent 30 years of his life making a game, his end comment was, "Don't spend 30 years of your life making a game," because the general theme was he kept changing it and adding to it and learning new things and wanted to change it again. And if it's an early game in your career, you're going to keep wanting to make it perfect, and you're going to spend forever tweaking and nudging this thing that's not really ever going to come out. And it makes a lot more sense for you to learn how to produce things on a schedule. It's very hard to do. Like, people do not realize how hard it is to consistently produce content. So
Mm.
even if you did want to make an MMO, just make a few other games first. Like, if you're about to dedicate 5 years of your life to make an MMO, just dedicate one first to make a different game. Just learn the process and steps so that you can then have a better sense of what it's like to take that, multiply its difficulty by 10, and then go into the next one, you know?
I think you're being generous too by saying multiply by 10.
I am, yeah. I'm also saying you would probably need at least 10 more people if you're being fair, but I'm trying to make it practical for the people who genuinely are trying to do this. So, yeah.
It's kind of a win-win too, if you think about it. I mean, if you really could dedicate 1 year to making a game successfully before you dive into your MMO, I mean, you really could leverage that year to make a name for yourself, to workshop ideas that you have for your MMO that you just work out in a single player scenario. Um, maybe you make your single player game, in the same universe as what your MMO is going to be, so you can kind of create hype in that way for the actual MMO if you ever complete it. But
And the other thing too is if you're asking yourself, like, I always ask myself why I do a certain task or job. And if you're asking
mm,
yourself why you're making an MMO, you've got two different answers you could say. Because I want to make a game studio, or I want to make an MMO. Like, that is literally my goal. If your goal is to make an MMO, then fine, make that your objective. If your goal is to make a game studio or to make game development your job or anything else even remotely tangential to that, don't make an MMO. Because the problem is that you don't get to decide what's popular. So when you make a game, you're basically rolling a dice and going, is this going to succeed? And you don't know what's going to people are going to latch onto. You don't know what's going to hit the perfect market at the right time and what the right idea is. And if you make an MMO, you're spending 4 or 5 years to roll that dice once. If you make a smaller game, you can try, you can change it, you can try again, you can change it, you can maybe make another game. You've got multiple chances. You're like, we said it last time, but it's the same as the whole Flappy Bird example. That is not his first game. That's just the one you've heard of. He made lots before it. He rolled lots of dice, and eventually he hit. You won't get that if you spend 5, 6 years for your very first game, or even one of your early games, and you decide, I'm going to make a giant MMO and hope that 5,000 or 10,000 people play it, because that's what I need for this to be successful. So,
yeah.
I don't know.
All right, that was your dose of MMO talk for this stream.
Yeah.
come back for the next one.
Yeah, I really want to not have this conversation again. So if anybody else still thinks I hate MMOs or that I'm down on Unity as an engine, then please listen again, because that's not what I said.
Yeah. I see Spaceman. I remember you asking in the last stream, Spaceman, that he was looking for tutorials on VR, and I don't think I linked it on the clip. There's a clip out there from that stream where Jason talked about some Udemy courses and actually mentioned that Unity has a VR course out now. So if anyone could link that for Spaceman. But Spaceman, if you go on the channel, look in the clip section, you should find the one about Udemy.
Mhm.
And
And on a more broad answer to that question, there's not that many courses or suggestions on how to do VR stuff. I know Unity3D.college has a couple that's worth a recommendation,
Yep.
friend of ours. Other than that, the problem is the technology stack they're built on, same with AR, they're both using some framework. So in the case of VR, you've either got the Steam VR stack or you've got the Oculus stack, and they change. Like, I've been doing VR for 2.5, 3 years, and it changes at least every 6 months ish.
Mm.
And it's competing with those changes on top of Unity changes, and it's just not worth it for a lot of course developers to dedicate that much time making a course that's going to change that often for the setup portion. And that's only for the setup bit that pertains to VR. Because once you've set it up for VR, other than that, it's just a game. So there's a lot of kind of highfalutin talk about how VR is unique in whatever concept, and you have to be very specifically good at VR. That is technically true insofar as you need to know what makes VR good. You need to know how scale it works. You need to know how to use presence and how to hit the lower reprojection rate so that you get high frame rates and stuff. Like, there's a lot of stuff you need to know to make an optimized VR game. But from a game design or gameplay perspective, you don't need to know that much. Once you set up a VR camera, it's just a game in Unity. So 90% of what you learn in any other 3D programming course will apply to VR. The only VR specific stuff is how do you set up the SDKs and how do you optimize and make kind of comfortable UX and UI experiences. And quite frankly, no course is going to teach you the UI and UX stuff. That's trial and error and looking at other games and doing your own research. And most courses don't want to spend the time it takes to set you up with a stack that's going to change in 6 months. So the answer is you're not really going to find one, at least not until I don't know. Actually, no, I just don't think you'll find one. There's a few for AR. It's a little bit quicker for a roundabout turnaround time. But again, same thing applies. For the most part, you're not going to find very specific courses. You're going to find Unity courses, and then you're going to find maybe a YouTube video online where someone shows you how to set up the SDK, and put those two together, and you have your course.
Well, I've never done VR development. I've been wanting to. I mean, honestly, I've just been wanting to get VR because it just seems awesome. But what percentage of a, I mean, that's kind of a broad question, but what percentage of a project could you develop before you absolutely needed to say, okay, and now I need to get the SDKs involved of a VR game? You know what I
Uh,
mean?
I'm I'm a bad candidate for this because you know my stance in terms of separation of concerns.
Oh, fair enough.
I I already spend 90% of my code not in Unity, and so when I do VR stuff, it already is not in Unity. And even when I do bring it in, I personally hate developing with the SDKs because if you put the SDKs in, you have to put a headset on every time you want to test it. Because this has infuriated me since the day they did this. But way back in the DK1 days, there wasn't a platform system. It was just a headset. You put it on, and that's your headset. Done. You know what I mean? And even more so than that, it didn't have an internal sensor. So because it was a cheap dev kit or cheaper than the others, you could hold it in your hand and you could just test like this, just rotating it and sort of look at your screen and see what you're seeing. Obviously, you get the better experience with the headset on, but if you're taking a headset on and off to debug lines of code for the space of a few hours, that gets very tedious. And what we used to do is used to take the straps off and hold it like goggles and for testing. But with the later headsets, the entire head clamp is like mounted to it, so you can't take the clamp off,
Hmm.
and the sensor can't be disabled. So you literally have to have your finger pressed over its sensor on the inside to get it to register as being on, which is a cool feature for various reasons. Like you have lots of standby stuff you can do, but it's bloody terrible to dev with. So, in short, I do as much as I physically can outside of Unity, or outside of Unity, and then whenever I'm in Unity, I do as much as I can outside of the headset. So the stuff that requires the headset really comes down to experience, checking the scale is right, the distance is right, checking that your UI is correctly placed at a good range, that your raycast controller works correctly. But again, you can test most of the raycast stuff outside of it. It mostly comes down to experience and in terms of like literally testing how it plays and the gameplay loop and stuff. So yeah, I really just try not to put VR in my VR as much as possible because again, a lot of people used to say it's personal, it's a separate skill to have, and it kind of is. Like it does require an awful lot of knowledge in terms of how people will experience your project, and there's a lot of really annoying nuisance things that you're not going to get unless you're doing VR. Like you're going to learn a lot about very specifically about things like overdraw and some really interesting stuff in terms of like lines. Jesus, lines are a pain inside of a VR because of the aliasing. You're going to get a lot of really true black is another one. You have to manage certain color stuff. There's a lot of really nuanced stuff, but you're only going to get that midway through a VR project. Realistically, most of what is a VR project comes down to how do you take a 3D spaced camera and just make the game good for that camera. So yeah, I don't know. It's not as all encompassing as people think to say make a VR game, but the stuff that'll take your time and requires the expertise is not the game stuff. The game stuff is still moving prefabs around and placing box colliders and doing raycast. Like 90% of what makes a VR game is still a game. So I wouldn't be too worried. If you're holding back on a project because you're waiting for VR stuff, test it with a character controller. You're not going to get the scale. You're not going to get some of the other stuff. But if you measure your boxes out, you can get there's a couple of great assets on the store. In fact, a friend of mine made one, Dark Akuma. He made an asset specifically for VR, which will let you change the transform gizmo to being in meters and like changing all the different measurements and to actually show you drawn measurements of the scene for how wide and deep certain areas are, which will allow you to basically test your scale for VR. And that's about the one thing you want to really get right. Make sure that the world scale looks good. So yeah, I don't know. Not VR. I wouldn't be too bogged down on finding VR as a course because
Hmm.
that's such a small percentage of you're better off find a 3D course, make a 3D game, watch GDC and Unite talks from VR developers. The guys behind uh, which games would be very good. Cloudhead do some really good courses. I think talks on stuff. Holden does another great one on GDC. I'll come up with some collection of them, but realistically, just go to GDC talks and go to Unite talks, and there are VR devs who do talks on the nuanced things you want to be careful of for VR. But other than that, most of it's just make a VR game, make a 3D game, and put VR in it.
We make a good point. VR is a more extreme example where, as you develop anything, you always want to close the feedback loop as tight as possible. And so, obviously, when you're thinking about VR, you're not going to be developing something, making a change to your code, putting on the headset, making sure that little change worked, taking off the headset, and making more changes. That's not a good iteration cycle at all. And I would even argue that the same thing applies to making code changes and then running your game directly in Unity just to test one little thing. I think that if you're going to test anything, you should do as much as you can in the code, including writing unit tests and integration tests. And the way you do that is something we talked about in the last stream, which is kind of an extreme example. Is the way Jason and I and many other Unity developers work is that we'll separate our project into multiple DLLs. So we'll write just regular plain old C# code, put that into its own project, and then reference that project, that DLL, in a Unity project. And in that way, you can actually test the plain C# code separately. You get all the advantages of running unit tests without the overhead of mono behaviors and having to run your scene. A lighter weight version of that would be if in your own project, in your Unity project, you can just separate your, I guess what you can call like your library code or your core code. As long as you keep it separate from your Unity code, then you can follow the same idea of just writing as much as you can and unit testing as much as you can using automated tests so that you close that feedback loop and um, you know you're not killing yourself waiting for things like Unity to start up.
Yeah, just the general loading times, like it's one of those things that you take for granted when you're a line of business developer. I never thought about it before, but going from, you build your code, you press play, it's a desktop app. There's no, you're not accessing any graphics libraries. It's just there is a window that's drawn, and it has a couple of fields on it. It didn't really hit me until I started doing game dev work on projects that are like 20 gig in size, and the load time is insanity, and you're waiting there for 15 minutes, and God forbid you accidentally move your mouse across the scene view, nudge a box, all of a sudden the light baker goes, oh, hang on a second, everything's in a new position, I have to rebake your entire project again, let's start from scratch. It's like, oh no. then you're stuck waiting for 15 minutes while everything grays out and starts filling up again. And by the way, my computer's not like that bad. I've got dual 1080s in it. I should be able to be processing my lighting efficiently. But no, even with a decent computer, it's still going to take you forever. So
Oh yeah, it takes forever.
pain in the ass. Pain in the ass.
We got a question here. Before we talk about that one, just want to remind everyone to hit that like button, smash that like button. It really helps. It's a good way to support the channel because it tells YouTube to recommend this stream. All right, so what kind of design pattern would you use for a story in your game? Any sources you happen to know of that talk about this? I have a hard time finding anything. I'm guessing story. You mean like a story system or like a dialogue system?
Yeah, I assume it's managing dialogue and things. It's one of those, again, not a helpful answer. I write my own. if I need a dialogue system, I'll just write one.
Pretty much.
Because it's not super specialized. There are some great tools. Like if you're not comfortable with that, there's a lot of really good visual editors. If you're doing like a Mass Effect style narrative flow thing. And in fact, fun fact, you can find the Mass Effect dialogue tree online, like the file that they actually use internally to build it.
Oh, that's cool.
So you can get a sense of how it works. And fun fact, it's just a giant text file. A lot of these systems are just giant text files with keywords and annotations. They get read in and parsed and processed because it's just far more efficient. It's much easier. And it also means that we talked about this last time, if you get a tool developer on board, you can have somebody build something that spits out a text file that can be imported into the game. So you don't have to have kind of the narrative artists have to mess with code stuff. So there are great tools for this. Another thing I recommend is there's actually a programming language designed for making interactive narratives. I cannot remember the name of it right off the top of my head. Is it Twine? Might be Twine. Either way, there are languages as well. Literally a language designed
That's
with
cool.
certain syntax and annotations. And the point of it is that it builds a narrative, and you mark when things are collected, or when a dialogue option requires a certain Boolean flag to be hit, or if some function has to be called that provides points, like you could have heal 20 or something demarcated inside the text, and then you just read it in, parse it, and subscribe to events, and you can make your system from there. So there's lots and lots of ways to do dialogue depending on how your game works.
He clarified and said that he was talking about just the story in general, progression of your game. So I guess in this case, you're probably talking about like a game like Skyrim, an RPG, where things change in the world. Maybe something more like probably Zelda Breath of the Wind. What is it called? Breath of the Wind? No, Breath of the Wild.
Breath of the Wild, yeah.
But yeah, basically the state of your entire game world changes, and I'm guessing that's what it is. And so then the game actually progresses itself, the story of the game. And really, there's no one answer to that.
No.
Because you can have a game like Final Fantasy that's super linear, or you could have a game like Breath of the Wind, right? Breath of the Wind that is open world, but there is certain state, like have a but even that one doesn't really have much of a state because you can't actually go straight to the end of the game, right, from the starting zone. Um, anyway, yeah, I guess what I would say is if you're thinking about developing a system like that that's so critical to your game, it sounds like you've already thought of a type of game where it has a story and progression. I think where I would say you'd want to start is thinking of how you can design, like what tools you can create to define your game's story at a high level. And this goes back to how we always talk about designing tooling for your own games. I would say, like, think about what a designer would have to do to add um, like a section of your game, or a portion of your game. And you don't want to have to rely on doing it in code. You want some sort of UI where they could say, okay, at this point in the game, these elements have to be in place. Things like that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jason, or if you agree.
No, yeah, no, I pretty much agree. The only thing I would say as a shorthand to, because as Charles pointed out, there's a lot of moving parts. It's not like there's a single answer to that question.
Yeah.
But something that will be helpful if you're looking for closer to a single answer is, more often than not, you'll find tutorials and guides on quest systems specifically, like the
Mm.
literal keyword quest, rather than whatever narrative or story or progress or saving, whatever else you want to call it. If you look for quest systems, there's tons and tons of courses. Like, wait, I remember some of the ones I used to do back in the UDK days, or back when XNA version 1.0 was a thing. And fundamentally, they all follow roughly the same rules. It's just you create an object that contains state for your quests or for your lines or whatever it is. You iterate through them, you cache them, you have some sort of flag system that indicates when certain flags have been hit or not.
Mhm.
How you specifically design it, it's entirely up to you. And there's not really a right answer. There's not like an out of the box correct solution. And that goes for 90% of these questions. There's not going to be in industry, 90% of companies do X. There's very few direct answers like that. The closest I can give you is, when doing audio, 90% of companies use WYs. Like stuff like that, I can give you a direct answer. There are set tools that are predominantly the features that people use. But for how to design X, who's on the dev team that week? That's entirely going to be the answer. So yeah, look for
Yeah.
quest stuff in general. That's probably a good bit of advice.
Yeah, I mean, to approach it from a high end, if you think of a quest, you have to figure out what are the elements that you need to encapsulate, and then go from there. Like it could be flags, it could be items that need to get picked up. Might be dialogue. There's a lot to consider, and yeah, there's 100 ways to skin. Or what's the expression? There's 10 ways to skin a cat. It's an
Yeah,
awful expression.
something like that.
Awful expression. I'm sorry, Chip. We weren't talking about you, buddy. Anyway, let's see. Do we have any other questions? Um, hope that answered your question there, Lewis.
Yeah,
Um,
here's a question about unit testing, which I think
okay.
is
Ooh, I love those.
yeah. I'll turn this one to you. When is and isn't it worth it? For an example,
Hmm.
if I had a function that returns an array of raycast hits based on a pattern of rays, would you test it?
Um, yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to find it so I can. Okay, here it is. If I have a function that returns an array of ray cast hits based on a pattern of rays that you give it, I mean, basically, when it's worth it to test is when it's fast and there's low overhead. I mean, eh, the easy answer would be like, oh, it's always worth it to unit test, which obviously is not true. I mean, there are cases where it's not worth it. I would say you want to test your business rules, absolutely. And I mean, business rules. We're a bunch of game developers, so basically, your main game mechanics are the rules of your game, the fundamental rules of your game world, the things that um, can be messed up by another developer. You want to make sure that you test those things. It's kind of a broad way to say that, but you want to expound on that, Jason?
Yeah. One thing I would say too
You're so
is,
good at like getting down into the. I offer the umbrella, and you go in there and you hit the details.
well, yeah, I guess I'll take that as a compliment. I will
Do.
say with those kinds of systems, the answer is if it's hard to test, if it gets to the point where you're having trouble testing it, then don't test it. I mean, it may sound like a hand wavy answer, but the fact of the matter is, when you think about a raycast is a collaborator. It's something you're working with. It's not something you wrote.
Mhm.
So don't test code that exists. Test code that you write. And so in the case of how do I test raycasts, you don't. You test if X system has been given a collection of raycast hits and they're all returning vector 30, this happens. If I return them back and one of the vectors is pointing left and one of them pointing right, this happens. You don't have to test specifically that the raycasts work. You have to test that a system, when given inputs, performs as you expect it to. And then you could have another system which tests, hey, if I run this code, does it give me back? If I hand it raycasts, does it give me back raycast hits? You don't need to test specifically that in this case this thing happened to match this exact input. Just test that it does what you expect it to do. And realistically, you only need to test the critical paths in your system. Like arbitrarily testing that raycasts happen doesn't really get you anywhere.
Yeah.
Testing that a raycast, if a raycast has hit something, it should change color. Test if I fake a raycast hitting it, will it still change color? That way, you're testing the actual logic of your application, and presumably, if the raycasting system works as it by just actively creating raycasts, and the thing that receives raycasts works by receiving a raycast, if so, pack so, the two will work together and they'll just sort of do what they're supposed to. There's integration tests as well, and that's more of a
Mhm.
user experience thing. At the end of it, once you have a system working together, you can integrate test the two. But realistically, like test that it works. You don't need to test the nitty gritty, and that's kind of a big problem with a lot of unit testing sort of die hard attitudes. And I want to really point that out. We're not going to toe the company line and say everyone needs the unit test all the time. What we're going to say is unit test when it's practical.
Yes.
And the kinds of things I unit test would be a health system, a stat system. I would test that a selection system would work. I may feed the selection system a raycast to make the selections, and I may have a selection system that can perform highlights, and I'll feed the highlight system into shader changing color or objects firing do-tween events. But I won't be testing that do-tween events fire, and I won't be testing that raycast fire. I will test my code, which says, given these inputs, does these outputs happen correctly?
Yeah. Like, for instance, let's say you have a game world where you have a player that walks around. There's some spikes on the floor, and when you walk on the spikes, you damage the player. I wouldn't go to the trouble of setting all that up in a test and trying to test that the on trigger gets called and uh, damage occurs. I would test the function, which probably would be like player dot take damage, and I would test all the rules that correspond to that particular function. Like, for instance, it can't go below 0, or that function cannot accept a negative number. Like if you had, like, let's say a spike object in your world where that would damage the player, and it had a serialized field that anyone could edit from the editor. I mean, you don't know what's going in that field. It could be a negative number. So you say, okay, all I know is that I've unit tested my player.take damage function, and it does not accept negative numbers. So you're covering your bases there. I wouldn't say to test the mono behavior and make sure that no one puts negative numbers there, just because it's just not worth it. And that goes back to what we mentioned earlier about separating your Unity code from your just basic C# code, the fundamental code that makes up your game, like core library code, if you will. Um, you don't know what you don't always know what Unity is going to do. You don't always know what a designer is going to do with your code. Someone might grab a mono behavior, put it on some game object, and in a way that you never would have planned for. So what's important is to get down to your fundamental code and make sure that at least that's guarded, and worry about uh, the worst thing you'll have to worry about is that that game designer will run the game and what they expected to happen didn't happen. But what won't happen is that your code won't fundamentally break. The player will not go below zero, which is a fundamentally incorrect thing to happen in pretty much any game, I would think. So that's kind of the thought process you need to have when you get to a decision point. You're like, should I test this? You need to ask yourself, is this fundamental? Like, is it acceptable for this thing to break? And something like players' health going below zero is not acceptable.
Yeah, and kind of a second point on that is, if you're being very pragmatic about your code, um, like I used to be particularly dogmatic on the idea. I liked the idea of 100% test code coverage and having these really swanky suite of tests that I can run constantly and prove that every line of code is ran beautifully. And it
So
starts to get,
idealistic.
yeah, exactly. It's not practical. It doesn't scale. It takes forever. Your team will hate you if you keep doing this and keep pushing the agenda, and
Oh yeah.
you end up getting into this really muddy situation where your code is so reliant on tests that all your tests break every time you change. Like, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and this is from someone saying you should be unit testing. Like, I'm not saying don't do it. I am saying be very cognizant of what the problems are, and the way you mitigate those is you choose good tests to write. And on top of that, you you are testing the cases that can go wrong, that can cause the most harm. So if you can find a way to mitigate that harm, you can solve that other side too. So a very common thing that I'll do is I write custom inspectors for anything I expect the designer to play with. Like, I don't let them use a inspector I haven't customized in some way. You can use Odin if you don't want to write them yourself. You can use the straightforward the attributes for just the basic stuff like ranges and whatever else, or just read up on the onValidate function. That alone will make a lot of your life easier. But the long and short of it all is make sure that you can't get bad inputs. If you write an editor inspector such that only valid values can be written into it, then you have a lot less problems to worry about in your testing. So in general, just make a point of ensuring that, because there's a common phrase, garbage in, garbage out. Like, you can't recover a system that's been given gibberish to work with. Like, you have to give it good data and give out good data, hopefully. So in general, yeah. So just make it work well. Make sure that you can't get too many odd cases, and then you don't need to test as much. And that stuff you are testing should be stuff that's bottleable, that you can put in a small container, test it like a black box. And like, literally it's called black box testing if I'm going to get very specific. But yeah, you literally go down the road of testing your inputs and outputs, and that'll cover the majority of your test related problems.
Yeah. Um, Baccaral says there's no way of testing if animations work, right? I don't mean is animation exactly like as planned, but is animation doing anything at all and reacted to
Um,
something?
Not that I know of, but
Yeah.
again, like, it's an unsatisfying answer, but it doesn't matter. Like, realistically, obviously at some point you're gonna have to go into the editor and make sure it works, but you shouldn't really be testing that it works, because at the end of the day, the animation system is a third party system that receives
They
events.
should be testing it. Unity Technologies should be testing it, and I'm sure they do.
Yeah. As long as you grab a reference to it and you set the various floats and ints that you need, you've done your job. I will say one thing though, for people who don't know, if you're ever writing set trigger and you're passing in a value, or set vector and you're passing in a float, don't use strings. There is animator.hash, and it will
Hmm.
get you a hash value from your string, and that's what Unity is using to reference those ints. If you don't do that, you're just performing a hash function for every single time you call it. So if you've got an update function that is setting a vector for your inputs, you're going to be constantly creating, um, that hash for every single frame of that update call. So in your awake function, take your string that represents whatever the trigger is, cache it as a hash, and then use the hash for all of your subsequent sets.
I think Writer actually has something. Maybe I'm thinking of tags, but Writer has a way to like intelligently suggest uh for the tag. Maybe I think it is the tag system, but maybe there's something they have for animations as well. But if you want to go add a tag, it'll actually I guess it'll pull a list from your editor and display them to you as IntelliSense. It's
That's
pretty
pretty
cool.
cool. Yeah.
I don't know if they can do the same thing and suggest the hash, but yeah.
There's been a couple of comments talking about computers and what computer to buy if you're doing development.
Mm.
Um, so the sneaky answer is just get the best computer you can get, obviously. The more nuanced answer is like a lot of people worry that that they don't have a super powerful computer to play their game on or to test it, but that's not your predominant audience either. So if you think about this again pragmatically, the machine you should actually get to test is the lowest computer you wish to support. Now, obviously, you might want to develop on something faster for the sake of getting work done. And in that case, don't get a laptop, get a computer. Unless you're literally going traveling around with it. Computers or laptops are cooler. You can have a lot more fun stuff moving it around and going to friends' houses and stuff. But realistically, you'll get a lot more bang for your buck. And if you think about it, if you're not making a game for a hobby, but you're making it for a living, then don't shortchange yourself. Don't get yourself a laptop for no reason if it's not going to actively benefit you as a laptop. Um, well, yeah, what was I saying? Oh, yeah. So if you are going down the road of getting a computer to test your game with, you want to make sure your game works on the lowest machine because
Mm.
realistically, if you make sure your game works amazingly on a high end machine, and then 40% of your user base don't have that and it plays badly, they're going to leave bad reviews and your game's going to tank. So you want to make sure that the experience is at least good enough for people on the lowest hardware you support. So don't throw away your older, crappier computer just yet. I would keep that and make a point of checking if your game supports that machine and set yourself a benchmark for what the lowest your support's going to be. So you have a good sense of what you should mark your game as minimum requirements for.
Yeah, I have a good example of this. I actually developed a little game for some of my coworkers back when I worked in an office, and I developed it using HDRP. HDRP. And so when I brought it into work to show everyone, I put it on the computer that runs like our Zoom meetings in our office. It took them to a big TV. It's not good. Spoiler alert. It didn't work. I ran the game. It was really choppy and it crashed. And I was like, ah, dang. And like I couldn't figure it out. I was like, what's the problem? Like it wasn't even that sophisticated, graphically, but because I used HDRP and I use all these fancy settings, it wouldn't run. So yeah, definitely want to
Yep.
use the lowest common denominator. And I haven't really played. I know that there's some emulation built into Unity where you can emulate lower quality graphics cards, I think, or settings. I don't know if you've ever played with that.
Not for graphic card stuff, but I have done some of and again, not Unity, but I've done some of the Android emulation for
Hmm.
different devices and seeing how it runs. And again, I just find it so damn slow. You're back in the same problem with VR where you're trying to emulate another device and make sure it runs, and
Yeah.
it's simulating clicks, and the clicks don't really come in correctly, and you've got lag, and it's very hard to tell what's going on. I personally only like those kinds of systems for if you're automating it, if you're using some sort of automated test tool that's going to like simulate swipes and stuff and give you inputs. They're really valuable to have a like visible test runner you can do that with.
Mm.
But realistically, there's no substitute for just having an app in your hands and testing it on multiple devices. And I don't know, it's just one of those costs I think people massively overestimate.
Mm.
Like you can buy cheap phones for, $40 or something. They're not end of the world. And
Yeah.
if you're trying to make a game with the intent of selling it, with the intent of making 30,000 a year minimum, spend $30 on a phone to test it on. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it may sound like I'm being trivial and saying just spend this money here and spend this money there, but if it's a job, if it's a career, if it's what you're trying to make money out of, you have to invest in it. Like it's not like if you can't afford it, fine. It's not. But it's if you can, don't skimp on it. Don't think that, oh well, I don't have to technically, so I'll just emulate it and whatever. You'll waste your own time setting up the emulator. You'll not get a good representation of what it's like, and then you're going to get weird bugs when it doesn't work on certain devices. If you can afford to pay for a couple of test devices, or hell, don't even pay for it, just borrow friends' phones. Get a group of friends to work with you on something. Find ways to test on actual practical devices.
Yeah. Definitely. I see a question here. How do I code instead of procrastinating about coding? When it comes to writing a game, is it good to plan? I've only ever done really fancy projects, not programs. How to not procrastinate? That's a big question.
If you find the answer, please tell me. I've
Yeah,
been looking for
share it
that
with the
one.
world. You'll be a
Yeah.
millionaire. You'll be rich. I mean, planning is good. I guess it just depends on what you're writing, what you're doing. You know, as Jason said earlier, you should always ask yourself what what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so, if your idea is, oh look, well, I'm just wondering how other programmers create a game. Do they sit down and plan it before writing it? Yeah, I mean, there's tons of ways to approach it. I mean, you could be someone who you could be the kind of person that can just sit down, code for hours without getting distracted, and knock out a really cool, game, and maybe that's how you operate. Um, Otherwise, I mean, some people really need to plan. If it's a project that you're planning on starting a business around, this is a game that you really need to sell and turn into, something that's profitable. It's probably recommended that you do some planning ahead of time. Um, Set expectations, set milestones, things like that. But if you're just like, I'm just trying to have fun and learn, it's a hobby. If you're just a hobbyist, then you're probably fine just doing whatever works for you, sitting down and coding something up and sharing it with your friends or whatever. But there's a lot of moving parts, to this question because it just depends on the context of where you are, what you're trying to accomplish, basically.
I'm gonna go a little bit hard on this one and have a hot take that might ruffle some
Ooh,
feathers on this one.
ooh, ooh.
So,
Get ready.
in my opinion, there are two things that most productive or artistic people in general get wrong. They just fundamentally misunderstand or lie to themselves about. And the first one is that I work better listening to music. This is factually wrong. Under every single considerable test that's ever been done, people are slower with music. The one exception is if you're doing something like folding envelopes. If you can get your brain into a rhythm, great, you're a bit faster. But anything that requires even a fraction of cognitive load, music will make you slower. Now, funnily enough, things like classical music make you less slower, but they do make you slower. There is nobody has been proven to work faster with music.
Hmm.
That being said, I work with music because I enjoy it. But I'm not lying to myself about the fact that it's making me better or faster or whatever else. So like don't not listen to music because you want to be whatever. But if you're like a perfect test of this is if you're working on some code and there's a bug you can't solve and you're listening to music, be honest with yourself. Do you pause the music because you need to concentrate better? And if
Oh,
so,
that's funny. Yeah.
ask yourself if the music was actually helping you or not.
Yeah.
So that's one. And two, people who jump in and start writing code are fundamentally less productive than people who plan first.
Mhm.
And this goes for every single facet of life. Now, there's a fine line between over planning and using planning as a procrastination tool
Mhm.
versus just getting work done. And the line I would say is you need to plan enough to know what your point is. Because what people do wrong, and this is again, you'll see it all the time, no matter what your profession is, there's a concept of doodling. Now, doodling is great when you're in school and you're playing and you're just drawing whatever. But I saw a TED talk recently where someone was talking about this. He basically learned how to draw in the space of 6 months and sort of went in depth on how to maximize his efficiency with this because he made a bet.
Because he was focused and he wasn't. Yeah. He was
He, yeah,
what's the word? Purposeful.
well, to be honest, he did one of the oldest trick in the book, and I've done this myself with a friend of mine. Is you make a bet for something you really don't want to lose. So in my case, it was $500. In this guy's case, it was $1,000.
I think was that
Um,
Blender Guru? Because he did the same thing.
yeah, it was actually. Thank you.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So he was learning to draw. So he decided
Mhm.
he was good at modeling, but he wanted to learn how to draw.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's perfect. That's what it was. But the general point is that he did this because you then have to if your goal is now maximize work, you have to try to get as much done as humanly possible. How do you do it? Well, you sit down and write your goal down. Now, when I say write your goal down, I don't mean go away and spend 6 months, making a business plan. What you want to do is make your goal for that month, that week, and that day, and that's it. For your month, what would I like to have done by the end of the month? What would I like to have done by the end of the week? What are the next actionable steps? And this is the other trick. Don't write down, I will have my game running. Write down, I
Actual
I will write
things.
the code for my movement system, and then break that down into actions and tasks and whatever. So, long story short, if you just start typing to make a game, you're not going to make a game. You're going to faff around for a while. You'll have fun doing it, but by the
Yeah.
end of it, you'll be like, did I learn anything? Did I get anywhere? Did I just play around? Now, this isn't to say you can't play around to find fun. Like if you say I want to build a system where I can shoot bullets, that is my goal at the end of the day. I want to write some code where I click my mouse and then bullets fire. You can then say after you've done that, I'm going to spend 3 hours messing because I want to check speeds and rates of fire and I want to find the funnest thing. But you have to write it down first. If you don't start your day with a goal, you have no way of measuring if you did correctly do your goal. So just literally, like, the answer is always plan, but plan to do precisely what you need to get done. Don't use it as a procrastination thing, and don't think just because you are writing code, you are doing work. They are not the same thing. They're
Yep.
very deceptively not the same thing. You could code for 4 hours and go, that was great. Oh, I just spent 4 hours making an animation system for my UI when I meant to sit down and write my movement code because it was boring or I was getting stuck, and so I decided to distract myself. So, yeah, do plan, always plan.
I saw a really good Tim Ferriss video the other day that really kind of opened my eyes to something that I was doing. And that's just because you're being productive doesn't mean you're being effective. And I see that with the whole YouTube, making YouTube videos. I could be very productive in a week, and for a long time, every video that I put out, I would work to caption it. I would do captioning by hand. I would recut it for Facebook. I would create a GIF for like Twitter specifically and Reddit. Anyway, I was doing all these auxiliary tasks outside of just making a video to put on YouTube that made me feel very productive. But if I look back at all the analytics, me cutting those Facebook videos, if I look at the percentage of viewers I get from Facebook, it's less than 1%. So I'm being productive, but that's not effective. That's not an effective use of my time. And the same thing goes to coding or creating a game. You have to think about what you're doing. And I think I saw someone in chat saying that they love to optimize before they move on. I mean, optimizing, you'll feel very productive. You might say, "Hey, look, this list isn't great. I'm gonna make my own optimal data structure so that it's very optimized, whatever." It's just not effective. If you think about what the ROI, the return on interest is, it's just you have to weigh those constantly, and that brings me back to another thing that you were saying, Jason, about setting, I think a daily, weekly, and a monthly. The point of those things is that you can always check in. You have to constantly be checking in. It's like a feedback loop, just like when you develop code. You write code, you check it and see what it did, and then you move on from that. And I don't think enough people do that with their lives. You do something, you need to check in with yourself and say, what did I do? Was it worth it? What did I get out of it? And should I do it again, or should I say that this was not effective? So yeah, those sorts of things definitely are valuable.
And if you're the kind of person who's like me and hates wishy-washy sentiments with very hard to quantify suggestions, where you actually want to give me a 10-step guide for me to do this so I can actually be more productive, there, get that
Oh,
book.
that's a good one.
So that's my number one suggested. If you want to get better at everything, organize your time, manage your projects, do stuff, this is your best book.
Let me recommend that you buy the book or get it on Kindle, because the audiobook is awful. It's so boring. I couldn't get through it.
Admittedly, I enjoyed the audiobook, but like it did. I went for walks with it, and it took me a long time. And then when I was done, I bought the book because it's just better in book form. And to be fair, if in the audiobook format, the first hour and a half is just telling you why the book works. And
Yeah.
it's a bit frustrating to hear that over and over
Like
again.
I was sold on it before you sold me on it, actually, before I even listened to it. So I was like, okay, can we just tell me what the method is?
Yeah, it did get a bit silly. You started and it's like, let me spend an hour explaining to you why this book is great. It's like, yeah, I bought it. Now,
It's
now tell me the stuff. But all jokes aside, once you get past that opening kind of sales pitch, like, it's not lying. Like, it's a really good way to manage your time. And a lot of other project management versions of like, there's so many different books on the topic. Most of them are cribbing from the same sheet. They're all basically the same ideas or literally stolen ideas. But yeah,
Someone
it's a good
says,
book.
see Charles' cat. That's me after 1 to 2 hours of productivity. Yeah, man. Sometimes you just gotta take a nap, take a little cat nap. Yeah, no, that book is great. So yeah, the original question is, do you plan? Yeah, you should probably plan, but I do think it's healthy every now and again to doodle, just to open up your editor and workshop things, but don't, it's very easy to turn that into a
Mm.
procrastination. And I
And
think
also, sorry,
no,
go ahead.
well, just one last thing. I think it's something that I try not to do is your time is valuable. And so if you do a doodle session, don't let it be a throwaway. Try to get something out of it, At least try to say, look, at the end of this session of me just banging out code, I want to have something that comes out of it. Because just to spend time on something and just to throw it away and it just nothing, you gain nothing from it. I don't think that's at least for me, it frustrates me to do that.
Exactly, and also doodling doesn't have to be boring. Like planning. Like I'm not saying when I say plan, I don't mean like lock yourself in a room with a notepad and write down, a 10-point bullet point plan. I'm saying planning could be as simple as getting a piece of paper, drawing a bunch of rectangles that represent the cards or the characters in your game,
Hmm.
and like getting two friends around and saying, "Hey, if I had this system and I move these things together, would that be fun?" Like the whole like paper testing is just as valuable as writing down notes. When I say plan, I just mean get in your head a shape of what you're about to do and give yourself some indicator that you're finished when it's done. I
Mhm.
will do a thing which has this feature, and you know then I know I'm done. Like I'm not saying that you have to sit down and write the entire system out. In fact, I actually recommend you don't do that. But what I am saying is you need to know before you sit down what the point of you sitting down is.
Mhm.
If you're going to sit down and say, "What will I work on today?" the answer is probably nothing. I'll just poke away at a few corners of things and maybe get something done.
Yeah.
If you say first, "What's outstanding? What do I need to do?" Okay, let's plan. If it's something like, "How will my combat system work? What would be fun?" Maybe the planning is watching some YouTube videos of other combat systems, or maybe the planning is,
Yeah.
literally go play some game that you like and then write down what you like about it. Like the planning could literally be just find out what it is, just so that when you sit down at your computer to work, you're there to work. You're not there to just sort of play around once you plan for that to be the case.
Actually, that's an interesting thing you just mentioned because it's something that it kind of dawned on me a couple months ago, and maybe it's obvious to everyone but me, but I was learning Blender, and I had picked up Blender, a while ago, and I was just kind of getting back into it, and I've done other artistic things, like designing my thumbnails, for instance, and designing things, whatever, in Photoshop. And one thing that kind of opened my eyes was, in the Blender tutorial, one of the steps was grab a picture of the thing you're modeling and you can actually put it into Blender in the background. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. And I thought like, dang, that applies to so many other things. Like it applies to game development. You should have a picture of what you're going to create available to look at. So an obvious example would be, and I actually use this because I suck at level design, and I was like, it's one thing I really wish I was good at, and so I was like, dang, I should apply this. So then one thing that I did to exercise this was I downloaded a 3D model pack of like an outdoor environment, and I literally just took the pictures that are on the asset page, and I was like, I'm gonna recreate that exactly. And in doing that, I was like, oh wow, I learned some things about placing assets and how to build an environment that I just never thought of before, because whenever I would create an environment, I would just have the assets and I'd be like, okay, I'll put a tree here and a tree here and a bush there. And then I'd just be like, this looks like crap. What am I doing? I don't even know what I'm doing. But the same thing applies for designing systems, like let's say you're designing a dialogue system. I think it's important to go and look at other dialogue systems, see how they work, maybe make like a little GIF or something so you can see it in action. And I think that would help you plan, help you to make decisions about your code. I just think that's a valuable thing. And if you saw Bracky's latest video on turn-based combat, he one of his sponsor for the video was like this Kanban board type application, and he actually does that. He takes little gifs of like Pokemon, I think, because he was making a turn-based game, and put it in there, and it's like, yeah, that's actually what you should be doing, even if you are a
Yeah.
coder.
I mean, I used Note for my last game jam. It's fantastic just to be able to grab snippets of code for things and reference it and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Although you did bring up a very good point, which is when it comes to getting reference material, like you said with the Blender thing, a fantastic example of this is if you're making levels.
Hmm.
So one of the best things you can do if you're trying to design out your levels for your game, get out a piece of paper, draw rectangles, get a sense of what the this is the character, and this is a corridor, and I'll put stuff here, and I'll have this thing, and basically draw out the shape of the room and how various loot items and pickups will be. Then take a picture of it, and then you take that picture, put it on a plane in Unity, scale it up, stick it on the ground, and then place boxes where the boxes were. Pro Builder's great for this. um, and you get a really quick, rapid prototyping session of what your game will actually play like. If you sit there at a blank slate, I can't do it. I personally, if
Yeah.
I'm looking at empty Unity, it's like an infinite sea of possibilities, and every single tree looks like it's is that too conspicuous? I put
Oh
a tree
yeah,
down. Do
totally.
people know it's a tree just put there? That's nonsense. So if you instead jot down some rectangles, get some senses of where things will go, you can use that as your literal foundation for what your application is. So the whole idea of getting some reference material and then putting it into the environment you're working in is fantastic. Like, it really makes your life easier to physically see a representation of what your design and layout is like.
And I think professionals do it. I think professionals, whether they're artists or game developers, what have you, I think they would say, "Yeah, you have to do that because working from a blank slate, it's like being productive versus being effective. It's not very. You might feel very productive if you create an entire level and you said, "Look, I did this from scratch with no other reference." It's like, okay, how long did it take you? If you really want to be effective, you need to find ways to be effective. And one way is to definitely not start with a blank slate for sure. And thinking back to some, I like to watch, artists, like speed drawings and any like sort of speed modeling, things like that. And come to think of it, generally speaking, I would say 90% of the time, there's always a reference. And actually, I saw an interview with one 3D modeler, and he said that whenever he's modeling something in Blender, on one monitor he'll have Blender, on the other monitor he'll set up like a rotating wallpaper that, or I forget what he uses, but basically it's like he just a bunch of images that rotate, every couple of seconds, and it's of the thing that he's modeling. So if it's like an anvil, which shout out to Blender Guru because that's what's in my head right now. He has an anvil course, and it's like that. You could have like a bunch of anvils constantly moving on your screen, and you'll see, and you'll have that in your head, and it's a good reference. And the same thing applies to game development. So yeah. By the way, Charles, you can also find a game with a level editor in it. Go in there and design your maps, etc. That's actually a good point. Yeah. Games with level editors. Also, a lot of the most famous games like PUBG started as mods. So yeah, that's an interesting
Well,
thought.
and I've said that definitely a few times, is that um, there's the reason I tend to get very frustrated when I hear people say things like the dreaded "I'm making an MMO" is because whenever you start any big endeavor like this, there's a load of areas that require a skill set you didn't know was a separate skill set. So when you first start writing software, you write some code and you press play and you're like, oh, this works. And then you find out later that in quote unquote real companies, there's a dev team and there's a QA team and then there's code reviews and pair programming. You're like, well, just write the code. Why do you need all of this nonsense? Until the first day you release your code and realize, hang on a second, it's got tons of bugs and I can't find them. And you're like, why can't I find them? I've been sitting here debugging my code for 2 weeks, and I hand it to a QA person and they immediately find 5 bugs I didn't find, because that's a separate job with a separate skill set. And
Yep.
so many parts of game design, because there's a fantastic quote, again, I wish I could remember who said it, but they said, when people ask, are games art? Games are all art, insofar as they have art and music and design and writing and philosophy. Everything's in a game. So by just nature of what it is, it has all other forms of art in it. And each one of those is a skill set.
Hmm.
So some of it's obvious, some of it's 3D modeling is a skill. But for people who don't do 3D modeling, they don't realize you can't just go to your 3D modeler and say, oh, make me a character for my game. Because they might go, oh, I may know how to 3D model, but I don't know how to optimize a 3D model. Or I don't know how to UV a model, or I don't know how to texture it correctly,
Or people specialize in like vegetation or hard
Mhm.
modeling and not characters.
or I can make your model, but I need LODs. What? Oh yeah, I don't know how to use ZBrush, or
Mm.
someone might come and say, I don't know how to rig, or I don't know. So just in the idea of go magically make me a model and give it to me for my game, you've got like 10 professions there. Now, obviously, you can get people who are skilled at multiple ones, and you can learn a lot more than just one. But there are a lot of skills in just that one task. And so when someone says to me, I'm going to make an MMO by myself, they are saying, I'm going to do all the jobs of the modelers, all the jobs of the artists, all the jobs of the audio engineers, all the jobs of the level designers, the balancers, the QA team, the dev team. And it's like you have no concept of how many things you're going to have to juggle, and you're going to have to learn so much. And it's amazing to me that people think that they can just make a game with, like, if you want to make a really good mobile game, you've already got to wear 10 hats. You don't just have to make the game as a programmer. You don't just have to make art. You're going to have to learn how to market your game. You're going to have to learn how to design the actual gameplay loops. You're going to learn how to do level design. You're going to have to learn how to balance your game. Depending on how your monetization works, you might need to learn how to use web services and systems that you might never have done before. You might have to learn what REST is and how that works, just so you can deal with monetizing your app. You might have to deal with integrating with Steam libraries if you're using notifications. Like, there's so many things, individual things, just to make a game. And so, like, yeah, there's a lot in it. There's an awful lot in a game. And so pick something small and learn how to do the various parts you need correctly.
Yep. Yep. This isn't
I,
to
for, I
say that you
forgot.
can't create a game. Plenty of people have done it. It's just, you just got to know what you're getting yourself into.
Yeah, I forgot where that one started. That got into the weeds a bit. Like you said, I tend
I
to
don't know
listen
if
to
it
things
was
like,
productivity or
yeah.
making a plan, but yeah.
Yeah, I will say though, just to end that point, I was talking about level design at one stage, and if you're into that kind of thing, something that's really fun is in October. There's a general theme of whiteboxing, and a lot of companies do this, and you can actually find it on Twitter. It's really fun. You'll get companies who will show you what their whitebox games are. Like, you can find um, white boxed versions of Gears of War, of Halo, of Overwatch, and they'll show you the game in like the jankiest bunch of rectangles clipping off each other way. I saw a Gears of War one once. I saw Bioshock. Like, there's so many games you can see. It's not just you. It's not like,
I didn't know that they did that. Can you
yeah,
explain what
yeah.
white boxing is for those who don't know?
So whiteboxing is, theoretically, if you took Mario, for example, as a game, and you removed all the sprites and all the textures and everything else, just a rectangle in each place where an enemy would be, and a rectangle representing Mario, your game should be fun. It won't be as fun. You don't have juice, you don't have art, you don't have all the cool sound effects, but it should be playable, and the soul, so to speak, of your game should be very noticeable. And so what whiteboxing is proving the point as quickly as possible. So you basically, if you're going to build an environment, and the whole point is I want to make a really cool space city, putting some blocks down should get you the sense of scale, and like, does this look dramatic, and like, do I need to put a sign here and I'll hang this over there, and there's just you'll get a greater sense of your game sort of feel long before you get to the point of drawing art and stuff. Normally what you do, actually, to kind of speak onto the multiple skills, you'll normally have a concept artist. And this is another thing that people take for granted. They think, a concept artist, you mean I'm going to pay someone 300 just to draw me a picture? It's like, no, they're going to like make your game for you. You cannot underestimate how important it is to have someone give a cohesive vision for your game, because you could go away and then try to get modelers and try to get artists, and people are like, I don't know what I'm making, and you end up losing a load of money trying to
Mhm.
get people to make stuff that fits the image in your head. Dealing one time with a concept artist to build a bunch of sketches that represent the soul of what you think your game should look like will save you so much time in pitching your vision to investors, in getting modelers and artists to work on it, to get the sound design team to be able to look at an image and go, make that sound good. Like,
Mhm.
everybody else is on board with the same idea. Again, I don't want to get down this road again, but my point is, usually what happens is one person is doing that. Meanwhile, the developers are making boxes that represent the trees and the rooms and the whatever, and they're testing the game plays well, while the other side of the camp is testing whether it looks good and it feels cohesive. And then the point is that the magic comes in kind of connecting the two pieces together.
Yeah. Well, I want to say something that I've been thinking about for a while during this stream about bringing up, but I just wasn't sure if I should bring it up, but let's just do it. As a game developer, you really do, or rather, like an indie game developer, because, that's different than just being a game developer who works for a company. As an indie game developer, you kind of have to be able to be good at delegating and good at bringing a lot of moving parts together. Because, there's going to be times where you're going to need to purchase models or hire someone to design art, maybe even hire someone from marketing. And you bring up a good point about having a concept artist. It's like you think of any cartoon like The Simpsons. It's not one guy who's drawing. One guy came up with the vision for The Simpsons or Family Guy and how that particular world looks and how the characters need to look. And if they're going to be at South Park too, there's a creative director, and then they hire artists to come on and they say, look, this is how you're going to draw characters and objects for this show. And so the concept applies for your game. If you do some planning up front, you figure out conceptually, what's the story going to be, what's the mood going to be, how's it going to look? Is it going to be like a high saturated cartoony look like World of Warcraft or Overwatch, or is it going to be like a darker look, like I don't know, Dark Souls or something like that? And from there, then you can take that vision, you have something solid to go and say, okay, now I can go hire some artists. At that point, it doesn't even really matter who you hire, as long as they can execute on the vision that's already been created. If they're skilled enough as an artist to emulate and execute a vision, then there you go. You saved money because you can go and you can find artists, and sound designers, level designers as well. You say, hey, look, level designer, here are the art assets. Here's some concepts for the game. You create the level. They can take that and use those things. But all this to say that as an indie game developer, you do need to be able to coordinate. You have to be like a coordinator. It's almost like a hat you need to put on where you're taking multiple different individuals in different fields and bringing them together and getting them to work on your vision.
Yeah, and a lot of people kind of don't really get what a game designer or kind of the job would be, and it's I don't know, it's really interesting because I don't want to get into this too. Another thing, bit of a side note, but if you're interested in this concept,
Hmm.
check out a video by Lindsay Ellis. It's mostly about film, but it's she does loads of amazing videos on breakdowns of mostly film, but like a lot of really interesting looks into a lot of concepts. Like one of them that's really good was in auteur theory. So effectively, if you're talking about what makes Kubrick, like how do we all
Mm.
know his stuff? That like what is it thematically? And the reason I bring it up is, love it or hate it, Peter Molyneux has had a profound effect on the games industry, and his style is very specific. Like he has artists he works with and people that have worked with him on numerous projects across numerous teams, but it's kind of like he may not be physically writing the code, but very clearly his impact is noticed on the team. Otherwise, the games wouldn't feel like the way they do.
Mm.
And the same goes with obviously the more recent craziness with Hideo Kojima. Like there are people who fundamentally take separate ideas and then make something out of it, and that person is wrangling the team together, and that's literally their job, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you think of big studios like Rockstar. All their games have the same look and feel to them. And what's that one? Project Red, the people who created
Oh,
Witcher,
CD Project Red,
CD
yeah.
Project Red. I mean, I'm willing to bet that if you were to look at Witcher and then oh God, I'm terrible with names. I have the worst memory. Cyberpunk.
Cyberpunk 2077, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. If you were to take a look at both those games, once that game is released, I'm sure you're gonna see similarities, um, between the art direction and the way the games play and the way they feel. If you're gonna start a, a company, a game design, God, I'm struggling with my words here. A game design company, you're going to have a creative vision, a creative direction, and at the end of the day, the people that work for you, all they're going to do is execute on that vision, and I think that's something that's important. And as an indie game developer, I think it's also important to create relationships with people, because if you work with the same individuals over and over again, not only are you going to be able to be more effective, but then a style is going to emerge out of that, and that's going to be very helpful, I think, because people are going to be able to recognize that style, just like you see with all these studios.
And honestly, some of them are just like it's a branding thing where you
Mm.
end up liking them for their work. Like
Mhm.
my personal favorite game director is Yoko Taro, and very specifically just because of Nier Automata. Like before that, I hadn't heard of him, but then I went back and I heard about Drakengard and Nier and a few others, and there's just something really compelling about his style, and it's like that's the whole auteur thing, you know. Like it's fascinating to see how a single person's vision can sort of meld all of the different concepts together.
Yeah. Yeah. And that vision, it gets created over the course of a long period of time. I think it has to be cultivated, and you can't get there until you start. So that's something to consider.
And mildly to bring it all the way back on track, what I was what I was mentioning with all of this originally is if you're interested in learning some of the more nuanced things that you might not realize is part of your job as a game developer, uh, look out for these things, and there's different resources for them. So, for example, if it's whiteboxing, which is a very tough thing to learn how to do, um, there's Blocktober, and that's sort of a month long thing, very common on Twitter, where people will start posting these gifs and videos and kind of talk through the process of them whiteboxing their levels. There's actually a really big community of Counter Strike level designers that do this,
Mm,
because again, mild detour on the same idea. People think level design is just putting the boxes in place and designing the shape of the level,
mm,
but if you create something like a multiplayer game, there's so many concerns you don't think about. For example, you cannot have a non symmetrical map in a multiplayer game
mm.
because you'll give an unfair advantage to one side. So there is a reason why literally every Counter Strike map, every Overwatch map is conceptually mirrored. It's identical because if it's not, it just makes the game unfair. And that's just one example. The other thing too is you may think an area looks really cool, but you might have accidentally created a sight line that goes from one end of the map to the other that makes snipers overpowered. And all of a sudden you've ruined the entire balance of the game because anybody who's playing the game picks sniper, game over. So design just the white boxing, you're already in a minefield of making sure the mechanics work. Height as well, like depending on the jump height of your character, you have to design the white boxing such that are the platforms the correct distance apart? Are the obstacles high enough? Are they comfortable to walk? Um, this kind of idea. There's a lot in it. There's a lot in design of just taking some boxes, putting a character controller in it, and making it functional.
Yeah.
And just to answer the comment, CS maps not mirrored. They're not mirrored if you're talking about attack and defense, because then it is actually balanced. It is still balanced because it's balanced for holding a point versus attacking a point. But the point is, it is literally that's my argument. My argument is that depending on the objective of the map, there is design implications in just putting the boxes down. If you're talking about two teams, uh, if you're doing something like, it's hard to describe what I mean, but depending on the map type you're going for, if it's two identical teams attacking the same objective in the middle, it needs to be identical in both sides. It needs to be symmetrical to be fair for that angle. But if it's a case of one team defending versus one team attacking, then obviously there's differences in terms of line of sight. But the point is, there's a lot of consideration in just taking some boxes already and designing that game.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you were talking about, like, Counter-Strike maps or multiplayer maps, and they're like, if you consider open world games, there's a completely different concept of where you position things in the world so that you kinda, like, hide the seams between different areas, like, so if you put the player in a valley, like, I guess, Breath of the Wind. No, Breath of the what is
Wild.
it?
Damn it, it's wild.
That's what I'm gonna call my MMO. Breath of the Wind. Breath of the Wild, there's a lot of creative, level design where you can never really see to the other end of the map. There's always something in the way, whether it be mountains or trees, or they put the player in a valley or something like that, or they make you walk through a really tight valley to get to the big open section of the world. Yeah, so all that to say, there's so many different skills that you don't even think about, like being able to design a map for multiplayer versus the skill of just being able to design a map for like an open world game. And that applies across the board, even like in audio. There's probably so many little niche things to learn and know. And I think, and
Yep.
that kind of goes back to one of the things we mentioned in the previous stream. You shouldn't try to make one big project. You should try to make a bunch of small projects. And I think what's valuable in that, not only is it pragmatic because you get to see the whole process, but I think it offers an opportunity for you as an indie game developer to find your style, find what you like to make. Maybe you're really good at making open world games, or and you just don't know it. And after you create a couple projects, you're gonna find where you're comfortable, where your wheelhouse is, and in that, once you figure that out for yourself, I think it really opens up a world. You might say, "Look, I'm really good at making multiplayer games." That's probably not. the case because multiplayer games are hard. So bad example, but let's say you're really good at making platformers. Okay, that you're really good at making like really difficult platformers. You spend a lot of time in the God, I forgot what the game Mario editor. What's that Mario game where you can edit the levels?
I'm gonna stop feeding you games after this one.
Yeah,
Uh,
please do.
Mario Maker is the one I
Mario
keep.
Maker. Let's say you're really good at making at that game, and you've made like a ton of levels that ton of people have played. So you're like, hey, I'm gonna make platformers. That's your wheelhouse, and then from there, you can figure out all the little niche things to learn about making really good platformers. And then, so I think that's a valuable thing to consider that I hadn't really thought about or articulated before. But yeah, I have a terrible memory, by the way.
But yeah, like the it's starting to get ridiculous. Uh,
I'm
the
drinking coffee here. I'm not. I'm not.
yeah, I'm the one drinking beer. I should be losing my
I
mind.
know. I was just
Uh,
thinking that.
but it's kind of yeah, it really is like there's just so much in it. Like another one, a lot of people might remember this, but Portal One. A lot of people have probably played Portal One. If
Yeah.
we don't even leave the first room, I could talk for 2 hours about the decisions that have been made in that opening room that you don't take, that you don't even consider. Something as simple as the starting room. Uh, you don't really think about it, but they leave you in a room with a little radio and a notepad, and it's arbitrary. It doesn't do anything. You pick it up, you can throw it around. That's not an arbitrary decision. They did that because they wanted to explain to you that you could pick things up without making it a big deal that is that like put a giant message up and say, quick, you can pick things up.
Yeah.
They purposely had an opening portion which has a little bit of opening dialogue and left you something in the room to play with so that there's only a couple of things to click on so you get a sense of learning how to pick things up. If you take too long, they'll give you some hints, but for the most part that's just there to let you like figure that out by yourself so you get a sense of achievement. Then when the game starts, there's a mirror across from you. Well, I say mirror, but they open a portal and the portal opens across from you so you can see yourself from a side view. And that's not arbitrary either. They specifically picked that angle from that side so that you could see what it's doing. You could see yourself walking and see yourself through the portal, so you'd get a sense of what the portal actually does. And then when you step through it and you start to go around the different areas of the room, you're in that opening box, and they show you the box that from the outside so you can see your own perception based on like even the floor height. They've raised the floor a little bit so that you get a sense of the perception change when you drop down. There's the shapes of the rooms are designed so that your line of sight can only give you a certain amount to focus on at a time, and then just when you turn that first corner, your first problem was the whole button and the box, and they purposely designed that so that there's only one way to solve it at the start, which is the whole button on the box thing. And this comes down to teaching you the mechanics. They didn't want to teach you to pick up the box initially. They're hoping you've figured out that you can pick things up from the previous room, and you've kind of brought that into this one. And there's a whole lot of other stuff, like the right down to the effects of when portals disintegrate and whether or not you can carry the box through the portals. There's very interesting decisions those have been recycled multiple times based on playtesting. Even other stuff, nobody remembers this. In there's a certain point in the game where you have to fling yourself for the first time across a giant gap. There's actually a mark on the floor where the tile is scuffed in a different texture on specifically the spot where you have to place the portal for that first jump. And people don't think about it. And honestly, I didn't see it until someone pointed it out to me, because it's only there to give you a subconscious visual cue to say this is roughly where you need to be. There's so much like, and this is we're still only at the point of and that the fun fact, most people don't know this. Portal was originally a game that was bought by Valve. They didn't make it in house. It was a game called Nabuncular Block. It's a weird name. I forgot that it's Nabuncular Drop. It was such a weird name anyway. But they actually tweaked the game a lot from the original game they bought, which is sort of like grungier looking. For example, you could originally shoot portals through portals, and they removed that mechanic because of how confusing it was. There's just so much. Yeah, like I could go on for days, and this is purely to say that so much decision making and so much iteration and game design goes into the really dumb things that you don't think about. And we're not even talking about code here, so you can imagine how much we could go into specifics about architecture and design. There's a million things to learn. And so when I say pick a small game, I'm not saying go easy on yourself and pick a small game. I'm saying you will have a very long journey learning how to make a small game.
Let me give you some
So
advice.
Yeah, it's a
start
very
there first.
effective way. It's someone actually asked in the chat, "How do I learn Unity?" Which is kind of a broad question because Unity is just a tool. Like it'd be like asking, how do I learn Photoshop? Well, why did you even download Photoshop? What are you trying to do with it? And so the answer to that question is, how do you learn Unity? You use it regularly, and you use it to do things that you're trying to accomplish. And in that, you're going to have to Google things and read the documentation, and that's how you're going to learn. So yeah, and I think we've harped on this a lot. Work on small projects, and to kind of bring it full circle to what we talked about earlier in the stream, pick a small project, write a plan for it, come up with some sort of design plan or whatever the case may be, get some reference material, collect all that up, put it somewhere that makes sense to you, whether it be maybe a Kanban board or maybe you need to print them out and put them on your desk and spread it out. Once you have all those pieces, build a game, start to finish, and repeat and rinse and repeat. I think that is the most one of probably the most effective ways that you can learn Unity quickly.
Hmm. And in the spirit of a conversation I had earlier today, if you're completely new to Unity and you want to learn how to make anything really, I would say start with someone like Blackthorn Prod. Their
Mm,
YouTube channel is great. They've got a course on Udemy, and they will show you how to make a game. You'll just basically follow along.
yeah.
You'll start with a plan of a game. You'll make it. It'll functionally be playable. You'll have various powers and mechanics and things, and that'll get you in. That'll get your foot in the door. And then from there, you can start customizing that project. And again, don't go ham and start making other things. Take the project you've just made and start adding new abilities to it and make new art for it and just really expand on what you've got, add new mechanics. And then once you're comfortable with that, start another small project and do 2 or 3 of those, and then jump into a bigger one after that.
Actually, yeah, I think that's a good point too. Get one of those Udemy courses that has a game start to finish. I would suggest, and this is just something that I remember I used to do this in college. I should still do it today. Um, Go through the whole tutorial, the whole course. It takes hours, of course. Finish the game, and then try to recreate that game from scratch by yourself. See how far you can get before you have to reference the course again. I think that's a pretty solid way to learn. I mean, it's just one way that I had employed before, and yeah, you're gonna get to a point where you watch a video and you think, "Oh, I understand the concept now." But then when you actually have to put it into practice, even if you've already done it, when you're following along with the tutorial, I think it's easy to take for granted that you're just following along. And even though you're typing out the things, it's not coming out of your own head. When you actually have to watch a tutorial and then say, "Okay, I'm going to do what I just learned from scratch," you're going to find that you don't really own the concept yet. And the way to own the concept is to try to do it until you can do it without watching the tutorial or the course or whatever. So I think that's a pretty valuable approach too.
Mhm. And it also just comes down to like you want to enjoy it, right? You want a sense of ownership of your project. You want
Mhm.
to customize it and make it something that you personally enjoy making. So there's a lot of like we said, there's a lot of work in it. So you could follow along with the course, and you now at the end of a course functionally know how to make levels and how to make a playable character and how to do a health system. You now you could take another month learning how to make engaging levels. You could take another 2 months and learning how to do juicing for your game, add really interesting visuals and sound effects. And if you're doing your own art, you could then take another month and learn how to do um, squash and stretch animations so that your animations feel more engaging. There's a load of different things you could take. So I really don't recommend people who are rushing out to make a giant game or even just rushing to make multiple games. Like
Mm,
either do the game jam approach and make tons of throwaway projects,
mm,
which is a great way to learn, or pick one project and learn multiple facets of that particular kind of project. And that's also a great way to learn. But one, as Charles said, do stuff. Like don't one of the worst things you can do, and this is as someone who's done that for years, is if you just watch tutorials and then just move on, you won't learn anything. Watching a tutorial is just, it's like watching a random TV show. You'll obtain half the information. If you
mhm.
watch a tutorial, the way I approach it is I watch a tutorial while I'm eating breakfast or something. Then I'll go to work. and then after work, I'll let that sort of simmer in the back of my head, and then I'll follow along with the tutorial again after I'm finished work, and that will mean I've got this sort of previous knowledge of what to expect with the course. So when I start the second time, I feel a lot more empowered as I go along, and it means I'm not going to stop and pause the videos as much. But it means by the end of it, I've literally done it myself. And a personal challenge I've learned that I like is I like to rename the variables and things from the courses I follow, just so that I force myself to know what the variables do.
Yeah.
I don't just write the code down, because you can turn your brain off if you do that. You just follow along with the course, and you don't even have to engage with what you're writing. You're just basically cloning code. But if you've changed the methods and variable names, you have to sort of convert it, which forces you to engage.
It's a good idea.
So, yeah.
It's a really good idea. I like that. Cool. Well, we're almost at the hour and a half mark, and I'm going to try to keep these at an hour and a half. So I'm going to say we didn't get to the code review today, but that's fine.
No, we kind of went a bit all over the place on this one.
It was a good talk. I hope you all enjoyed it. For the next, so this is going to be weekly for those who don't know, and it has been weekly. We want to incorporate code reviews for every single one of these streams that we do, and to kind of inspire you guys to share your code, because we're going to be ripping it apart live. I'm going to think of something to give out to those people that we review their code, whether it be like an Infallible code pin or T-shirt, or like an asset off the Unity asset store. If you guys have any suggestions, things that you would like from that, please drop them in Discord. And hopefully, we'll get some more submissions, and next week we'll actually be able to do a code review. We can probably review the one that I have lined up here, but yeah, it's definitely, we're not gonna have enough time to do it in the next 5 minutes. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. This is a good stream. You got anything to add before we sign off there, Jason? Good rants today?
No, I think everyone will agree I've talked more than enough today so far.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the clips out of this one. All right, well, I think let's end it. See you guys later. Hopefully I can get ahead of it, but I think it'll either be Tuesday or Wednesday. Next week is when we're going to stream again. So, all right. Later, guys.